No one wants to be in that plane of existence where they're just being. The Bible becomes a mixed bag for you where you're literally saying everything in the Bible that talks about God is actually the exact opposite of what it's saying.
Wow.
I'm at least suspicious that Gnostic thought in some capacity has influenced Christianity today.
Welcome to Truth and Tradition. In this episode, I'm speaking with Jonathan Greenfield, host of the YouTube channel Wonton Disciple and a very dear friend of mine. Jonathan has done extensive research in both church history as well as Christian theology. And in this episode, we're talking about a very interesting subject, Gnosticism. Gnosticism is an early church heresy, meaning that it's a belief system that is widely rejected by Christians. Gnostic thought was developed shortly after the establishment of the Christian church, so it has been rejected by mainstream Christians for centuries. However, Jonathan believes that Gnosticism, as well as Greek philosophy, have been affecting the Christian church in both its beliefs and practices to this very day. Let's dive into it. Jonathan Greenfield, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
So glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Jackson. So good to be here with a good friend and a familiar face, a happy face.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, when I was thinking about this episode, I was just very excited because first off, you are very comfortable in front of the camera. You have experience on YouTube. But beyond that, you know, someone that I know, someone we've talked about these issues with. And so it was definitely an easy first episode and just super great to be able to speak with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jackson here looks incredibly professional. I didn't purposely dress like a bum, of course. I had to represent our high school where Jackson and
I got the colors too. So
yeah, the maroon
Yeah.
and black. Yeah, so I look like a bum on purpose, I promise. And for those who are just listening, it's our logo of our high school here. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, today we're talking about Gnosticism. We're talking about Neoplatonism. We're also talking about Augustine and his theology. So we're talking about a lot of big topics, a lot of topics that might not be super familiar to everyone listening to this podcast. And so before we really dive in deep into Augustine and his theology and how it's affected current Christians today, I wanted to kind of define some terms and talk about what is Gnosticism. So, Jonathan, if you could maybe just define Gnosticism in a few sentences, what is that exactly?
Yeah. So Gnosticism, like Gnostic beliefs and traditions, they're not monolithic, so they do differ between different groups. But in essence, a lot of what we're familiar with, of course, is that ancient Gnosticism involved secret knowledge. It was usually knowledge only attainable by certain spiritual people, or that's what they believed anyways. And then, of course, it's also more than that. It's also kind of creating a barrier between the spiritual and the physical in a way that the Bible doesn't really describe, at least how us Christians are used to, because they think of the flesh and the physical as something inherently evil or wicked or corrupt. And that's something that conflicts a lot with how the Bible describes the physical and spiritual and how they interact. They're not separate in that way.
Can you dive into what you mean by not a monolithic belief system? How might that differ from Christianity today and what believers hold to today?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different kinds of Gnostics. There are Gnostics that are determinists, where they believe the future is completely settled, that everything is fated to be exactly as it is, and whatever happened as it was supposed to. versus like maybe someone like an open theist who's a Christian would believe that the future is open, that people can make whatever free decision they like, and their decision decides what happens in the future, not some fated, determined event. And so that's one form of Gnosticism. Other forms of Gnosticism involve like heavy forms of idolatry where they use physical objects and try to tie in with the spiritual realm and receive secrets from spirits that they consider divine truths, things like that.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed in any of the like texts, like when you look at the Gospel of, say, Judas or the Gospel of Thomas, which are not canonical like parts of the Bible, but they're kind of later scriptures that Gnostic theologians, I don't know if you'd call them theologians, but Gnostic believers wrote. And a lot of it has to do with this idea of like secret wisdom and like secret knowledge about Jesus. Jesus favored Thomas. And so he's the special disciple who received all the secret spiritual knowledge that Jesus is giving to specific disciples. That seems to be kind of the focus, at least when it comes to like Gnosticism.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And there's a very important reason why we're talking about it, and it's because like I'm at least suspicious that Gnostic thought in some capacity has influenced Christianity today, because the distinction between Gnosticism and Christianity is that, and I think Origen does a really good job explaining that Christianity and spirituality is supposed to be easily accessible for the layperson, whereas Gnosticism, like, only a special core group. Only if you're a part of the in crowd is it really accessible to you. And that's problematic for a God who supposedly loves the whole world, right?
So yeah, can you maybe explain how has Gnostic belief influenced today's church and today's Christians?
Yeah, so in so many ways, I think probably in ways that I haven't even imagined or thought of, we've been influenced by ancient philosophies, including those that come from Gnosticism. The one who's like most guilty of doing and influencing us with Gnostic thought is probably the Church Father Augustine. A lot of people, especially open theists, point to him for a lot of the bad philosophies and bad doctrines and the systematics that we have today. Augustine himself was very much influenced by Plato, and I guess we should probably just set the foundation on what it was like to be a Greek thinker back then, since we're talking about Plato.
Yeah, you mentioned Neoplatonism, and you mentioned Plato, which are huge schools of thought at the time in history, post resurrection of Jesus. And Neoplatonism is kind of the influence that we, or a big impact on the influence that we find for Gnosticism, and how that early church, like heresy, was established. And so I guess how would you define Neoplatonism and the thought process that people had at that time?
Neoplatonism is committed to this idea that in order for a divine being to be perfect, it has to meet certain requirements, or for anything in particular to reach kind of like this level of divine perfection, which is, first and foremost, it has to be unchanging. Like they call it immutable. It has to not change in any way whatsoever, and not just in its character and its attributes or anything like that, but it can't change whatsoever. So, for example, right now I'm speaking, and then when I pause, I go from speaking to non-speaking, which is technically a change. And so, in their eyes, in a Greek philosopher's mind, a perfect divine being, especially a God, would never change, and any kind of change, of course, would result in imperfection, which I would say, personally, I have a problem with that. You and I know a clock is perfectly well and actually we want it to change constantly. Otherwise, if it didn't change, it would be broken, because the hands have to change every second. One of the hands has to change every second, and another every 60 seconds. And in the same way, I think a relational God, a Christian God, one who interacts with us, and firstly through the law and the prophets, and then through Jesus Christ himself, who was a temporal being, varying in emotion and changing in his temperament, changing the things that he does, changing his mind a lot. Those kinds of things indicate that Christ and the God of the Jews is different from Neoplatonism. And then the second thing, maybe not all Neoplatonists would fall into this camp, but I know Augustine did for sure, would be impassibility. Like, gods cannot be affected by us or by the world in any way. So if I were to do something that would offend God, for example, he can't actively be offended. Otherwise, I would be influencing him in some way, and that would make him less than perfect. But of course, God in the Bible reacts to sin constantly, like all the time.
Yeah.
And we can get into that, but I mean, some of the biggest examples, of course, is Moses, and Moses is interceding for his people after they worship the golden calf, and he's wanting to destroy them, and then Moses is appealing to God's mercy, and like, look, for your name's sake, just spare them. And God changes his mind, and he's affected by Moses' prayer, not in the sense that God is not perfect. He perfectly knew he could spare the Israelites, and he definitely desired it. But he's a relational God, and he wants to hear the prayers of his people. It doesn't make him any less perfect to change his mind if he does just as good a thing as he was going to do prior. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I think those two ideas, the one that, God is unchanging, and second, that we cannot influence God. Or I should say perfection is unchanging, and the second is that we cannot influence God or gods.
Yeah. For those who are having trouble following, and especially for those who are like, well, like, I don't see those two beliefs as a problem. Like, that's not an issue for me. Like, I understand God as immutable and impassible is the terms, that he's unaffected by us and our actions, and he never changes in any way possible. But there is a problem with that, and I'm just going to mention Arianism. Everybody knows the heresy of Arianism if you've done a little bit of study, which essentially boils down to, yes, they thought of Jesus Christ as somewhat of a divine figure, but he was not God in the same way that God the Father is God, which of course is a heresy. Like, we believe Jesus is God and he's part of the Trinity, and, well, at least some of us do. And the reason they didn't believe Jesus was the same kind of God as God the Father was primarily because of those two schools of thought. They saw that Jesus was seeing the centurion exercise faith, and he changed his mind, and he reacted to him, being amazed and surprised at the man who showed such faith. And Jesus saying, I've not seen a faith like this in all of Israel, or whatever. I may be paraphrasing. But they see Jesus operating in time, changing, having fluctuating emotions, and then also being affected by people's actions. And that's why they don't believe Jesus is God in the same way that God the Father is. And so that's why these schools of thought need to be tested. That's why we need to push back against them a little bit and challenge people. They don't have to agree with myself or with Jackson precisely, but there are thoughts that and philosophies that we have that we don't even realize we assume upon the text.
Do you know much about Marcion at all?
Marcionism?
Yeah.
Not a whole lot, no.
So the idea behind Marcionism is that he believed that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, was this idea of the evil creator God. And so while Gnostics would kind of have the perspective of God, the creator God of the physical world is Satan, and then God, as we know, who is through Jesus, is the God who's created the immaterial world. His idea is very similar to that, except he equates Yahweh to being the evil creator God. And so he points to like parts, like you said, where God can't seem to make up his mind, like he's about to destroy the Israelites. And then Moses has to step in and change his mind and say, hey, look, please, would you spare them for my sake? But you just mentioned that, and I had been thinking about Marcionism and how it might relate to Gnosticism.
Yeah.
And that was very interesting. So I want to get back to these two schools of thought. But before we get back to those two schools of thought, maybe your way of explaining how a perfect God could be the opposite of those things, or may not have to follow by those philosophical principles. Before we get there, my question for you is, how did these ideas influence Augustine and the theology that we get from him to this very day?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because Augustine, you can read his writings and not truly understand where he's coming from. Like John Calvin would assume that he gets his ideas directly from Scripture, because Augustine, of course, loved the Scriptures. But if you read his confessions, you can literally read his own writings. I think it's around book 7 he really gets into Neoplatonism, and then he also shares the story about Ambrose that I mentioned before. Ambrose was a bishop over Augustine's mother, who also was influenced by these schools of thought, and he taught these kinds of philosophies first and foremost to Augustine, who openly admits that he is glad he learned these philosophies prior to reading the Bible, because he said if he had read the Bible literally, especially the Old Testament, seeing that God is affected by people and changing his mind, he would have thought it as lesser than, and he would have denied and ditched Christianity altogether, because he didn't think a God could be like that, because if it was, it would be less than perfect in his Greek mind. So he was more concerned with kind of the power and the glory and the majesty of God, and not so much the relational status of God with his people, the goodness of God, the character of God. Like, his perfection kind of had to do with God's ontology, just how God is made up, rather than who God is, which is exactly what, when you and I sing worship songs or whatever you want to call them, we're not talking about God being like outside of time, not changing, expressing 100% of his emotions at all time, as if that's the amazing thing. The amazing thing is that God has had mercy on us sinners.
Yeah.
And that's what we sing about, because that's what we know is true. Now that he had these philosophies set in stone, he would read the Old Testament, see that God was reacting in real time, and he was a temporal being, and he was being affected by people and by the world. And he would consider those anthropomorphisms. Essentially, God is acting in such a way that human beings can understand, but that's not actually what's happening in reality. What's happening in reality, like, for example, Augustine didn't actually believe God was speaking actively when the Bible said he was speaking, but rather he was thanking God that God had some arbiter of some sort that was speaking on his behalf, while God was just existing outside of time, just not changing in any way, including in the deeds that he did. Because if he spoke from non-speaking, that's a change, and Augustine couldn't accept that. And so that kind of makes you think a little bit. Every time you see God saying like he had compassion on someone, God actually wasn't having compassion on that person. Because if God was, that's sequence. That's him operating in time. That's him being affected by that person. That's him changing from not having compassion to having compassion. So you can see why suddenly the Bible becomes a mixed bag for you, where you're literally saying everything in the Bible that talks about God is actually the exact opposite of what it's saying.
Wow. That's so wild. That's like That's hard to even have a relationship with God, because like at the end of the day, that's kind of what it's all about. But then you're reading scripture and you're like, oh, well, it's saying God's saying this or God's doing this or feeling this, but he can never actually change. And so he can't actually be doing these things or saying these things. And that's actually very interesting because it almost restricts God. It restricts him to this being that because he can never change, because he's perfect, he can't really do anything. Like what can a God like that actually accomplish or achieve?
Yeah. He has to have a pre-existent decree that acts on his behalf. So it is his decree, according to, like, of course, Calvinists and the Reformers and maybe even Augustine, had he thought out his beliefs even further. And so it's almost like the decree is pre-existent, just like God is, and immutable and impassible and settled, just like God is. And so kind of the decree is kind of like the fourth head of the Trinity that we don't really talk about. And it acts on behalf of God so that God doesn't have to do anything. And it's interesting, whether or not you're Calvinist or non-Calvinist, we all have a doctrine of predestination. We're all familiar with that word. We all have our beliefs about what that word means. But if you're like the Greeks and you believe God is outside of time, unaffected by the world, you don't actually believe in predestination, because if God predetermined anything, he did something in sequence, in time. He did something before the world was created. That's a temporal timeline. And according to the Greeks, God can't operate in time because temporal actions result in a change from doing nothing to doing something. And so, like, you can't even hold this belief of God being this kind of being and then also believe in predestination. So you read Ephesians 1 and Romans 8 and 9, and you're like, these words don't mean what I've actually been saying they've been meaning this whole time. So it's like the same thing. You're saying words that don't mean what they mean. So utterly confusing and absolutely unlivable. Like, it's an untenable belief. You can't live it out on a daily basis.
That's so interesting. What were those verses that you mentioned? They were Ephesians 1?
Yeah, so Ephesians 1 is one common proof text for predestination and adoption, of course. I personally don't believe it's talking about, like, predestine those who will become believers, but rather predestining a specific role for believers. So believers will be predestined to do these things according to God's work in them. But, yeah, regardless of whether you think predestination is a role or whether it's salvation, it still insinuates that God did something before the creation of the world, which would totally contradict this Greek philosophy that Augustine and Calvinists and the Reformers and even many non-Calvinists today hold to. If you believe that God is outside of time, that's a Augustinian Neoplatonist thought. That's Greek philosophy.
So this idea that God is spaceless and timeless, we've established that that's, Neoplatonist. That's a Greek idea. And because of that, there could be no predestination, because that assumes a time. I'm just trying to kind of understand what you're saying. That assumes that there was a point at which where God was like, okay, I'm going to assign this to happen. I'm going to destine this to happen. Yep. And it happened before that occurrence would occur.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you're saying here.
Yeah. I mean, the word pre is a temporal term. Like, you have to have a before and after if you're going to use the word pre.
You mentioned earlier the decree itself, like God's decrees enacting his will is almost like the fourth member of the Trinity. So how does that fit into this idea that God is timeless? Because I'm looking at this and it's kind of like, all right, so we have God who's decreeing things in order for them to happen, but God is not within time. And so these decrees aren't really happening beforehand or afterhand or during. They're just kind of there floating in the universe, and then it just happens. I guess, do you have maybe an example of how that might be understood?
Yeah. So we can actually tie this kind of back to the Greeks. With Zeus and the Fates, there's something like that established in Greek mythology, in that a lot of Greek pagans believed that Zeus was outside of time and wholly unconcerned with activities of humans. And he did exactly according to what the Fates had determined for him to do. And so in the same way that the decree is pre-existent from everlasting to everlasting in relation to God, Zeus also is pre-existent with the Fates and does only according to what the Fates have determined. And so God is not free to do anything other than what his decree allows for him to do under that view. God cannot change his mind. The decree existed with him from all time, before and then afterwards, because he couldn't have decreed at one point. That would be a temporal action. And he'd go from not decreeing to decreeing, which is a change. And so it's a little confusing to explain to people who haven't really nailed down these philosophies and kind of thought them through, like what their logical conclusion is. But essentially, the decree has to be pre-existent just as God is, and God is subject to it, even though the Bible leaves plenty of examples of God changing his mind even after he's decreed some things, like, for example, him decreeing that he would never listen to Israel again in the prophets, and then they cry out to him and he is moved by his compassion and he listens anyways, even though he decreed that he wouldn't. And so he was perfectly just in not listening to them because they were horrible. But he's also so merciful, and that's also a good thing. It's like moving from one mode of perfection to another, and they're unique, but they're both perfect.
So we have this idea of God being outside of time, and maybe an example that kind of just popped in my head is this idea that, oh, this worship song hit me at the right point, like I was just laid off or something, and this worship song, I turn on the radio and it's singing about finding joy in the struggle and in the battle. And maybe, the Christian artist talks about how they got laid off and how God helped them through that situation. So it's almost like this very intentional divine intervention where God decreed, at this point, this song is going to play. And this artist is going to also talk about this very similar situation so that I can meet Jeff, who just lost his job. And so we have a really intentional, like, beautiful moment like that God decreed outside of time. It just is there, and it's you can't really even say it's waiting to happen. It just happens, and God didn't necessarily do those things, but he decreed it to happen, and it then happened. Is that kind of maybe a good example of that?
Yeah, so I'll draw a picture using your example of what God is actually doing under like the Greek thought. The person who's receiving the decree from God and being comforted by God, they're thinking in their brain like that God is loving me right now. He's lavishing his love upon me. He's so merciful to me, and he's really enjoying being with me right now. But God can't do any of those things. He's literally existing in another plane, not changing whatsoever, and he can't interact with you in any way. And so what's actually interacting with you is God's decree prior to you existing, however you want to think of that. And so what's really interacting with you is the decree of God, and God is in some other realm existing as he is, and you just get to benefit from this decree that he issued to you for whatever reason. God is not actually having an active relationship with you. He's just commissioned some sort of act of his prior to you existing, and it is taking care of you on his behalf, because he can't leave his mode of perfection for your sake. He's got to be perfect ontologically, and that matters most to God, rather than loving you right now, or rather than coming and hugging you like a father hugs his son, or sitting down with you and listening to you in the moment. Like, God can't listen to you as you're praying. When you pray to him right now, he's not actively hearing you. He just knows in his current state that at one point John was praying at 7:55 p.m. on November 6th, and he's not actively listening to my prayer. You see how that's somewhat problematic?
Yeah. No, that's very interesting, and that makes a lot of sense why it would be problematic, because we see Jesus as this person who has committed such a beautiful act of love and self-sacrifice through his death for all humanity to be saved, and then to think that the God who did that isn't even really around at all ever, but is merely decreeing all these things, and we are really just reaping the benefit of those decrees. It makes sense logically, but it would feel a little more empty.
Yeah. Plus, I don't know how you feel, and I certainly would not feel great about reaching the new heavens and the new earth, and our whole existence is just to be, and to not interact, but just to be ontologically perfect and expressing all of our emotions and everything all at once, and never changing, never interacting in the way that we know how to interact today. And so that's a scary thought. I think atheists would have a lot of ammunition in the chamber if that was the true Christian belief, because no one wants to be in that plane of existence where they're just being.
You're just kind of there, and that's it for eternity.
Yeah. So.
People are a lot of Christians are worried about, singing songs forever. Can you imagine just being forever and nothing? Just it's
horrifying. That sounds like hell.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. Oh boy. Dang. So we've kind of established the problem here, philosophically, with why these two schools of thought aren't the best ways to understand the Bible and understand Christianity and who God is. So can you maybe explain how a perfect God can be changing, and how a perfect God can maybe be influenced by people? Because at first thought, that seems to be also problematic, because if people can reach out and almost influence God and change his maybe mind, or maybe God's going to do this, but then humans do that, and God's decree can no longer happen, that also seems problematic, because, well, then God isn't omnipotent. He's not omniscient. He's not these terms that we hold to. He's not all powerful. He's not all knowing. So how can you maybe accept those concepts under a while also dropping these two schools of thought?
Yeah. David Bentley Hart, he's a universalist, but him and I disagree quite a bit. I think he has also adopted a lot of Greek philosophy, in that God kind of has to be the highest being imaginable ontologically. Like, he has to be pure, and he has to be timeless, and he has to be all these things. But the problem I see with that is the Bible gives us no indication of whether or not God is timeless, we can't derive that from the text. You have to assume that while coming to the text. So that's purely a philosophy. And then another thing I want to say is that if God is being anthropomorphic, he's demonstrating like who he is in a way that we can understand. Why are we trying so hard to understand him in a way that God is not revealing himself to be? God wants to reveal himself exactly as he wishes. So we shouldn't try to usurp his authority in trying to figure out, okay, what exactly is God like in this way? We should prioritize what would make God look the most Christ-like, the most merciful, the most loving, the most just God possible. And that should take priority over whether or not God is atemporal or he's like this extremely divine being that we couldn't possibly imagine.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with YouTuber and friend Jonathan Greenfield. Be sure to check out his channel linked in the description and show notes below. And be sure to follow this podcast on Instagram at truth_tradition24 for all the updates. I'm going to leave you guys with a short quote from Plato himself. The true love of knowledge naturally strives for truth and is not content with common opinion, but soars with undimmed and unwearied passion till he grasps the essential nature of things. And I hope that's what this channel will do and what you guys will strive to do as we seek for truth and try to understand the traditions that influence us. Thank you.